Good morning, everybody. Today we are going to be looking at the pipeline in PowerShell, and we're also going to look at calculated properties. Ooh, exciting. Right, so first of all, the pipeline. Now, what is the pipeline? This nice little icon next to the Z key on your keyboard, or character should I say, rather than icon, to the left of the Z key on your keyboard. The pipeline's been around for many years. You can trace its origins back to the Unix services back in the 1960s, and there's some nice videos on that. Anybody who's spent considerable time in Linux or Unix land will have seen this pipeline before. But for Windows administrators, maybe not so much. So, let's see what this could actually do for us. So if we take a very simple command like get service spooler and run that, you'll notice I have this print spooler service actually nicely running for me. Now what I can actually do is I can pass that print spooler service via a pipeline to stop-spooler. And by running this line again, I should have, whoops, not stop spooler, stop service. My mistake. Stop service. And I go and run get service again. Notice this service is stopped. So that has actually worked. Get service spooler has been piped to stop-service and it stopped a service. If I go through and I do start-service again, actually play that again, and then just play get service spooler, notice I have a running spooler service. But the point is, why did that work? Because the pipeline is used extremely heavily in everything we do within PowerShell. Taking the outputs of one command and putting them into the inputs of another command. But there's actually two things really going on here. Remember when we talked about parameters, and we also talked about properties? Well, it comes back to this. So on one side of this, the get service spooler is actually producing properties. On the other side of this equation, start service actually has parameters that are going to absorb those properties. So we need to look at actually both sides of this equation. So let's go have a look at start service first. So within start service, what I want to do is I want to actually see the parameters that start service can actually take. So let's just go and do this on the shell on the left hand side here. To do that, very simple. We just go to get help and we do start-service. And by looking in here, let's just do this with not get help, let's do this with get help dash full to show the whole help. And what we can see is all of the parameters that this start service actually accepts. So if we go through here and actually have a look at some of these parameters, notice this option here for a variety of these parameters, accept pipeline input false. Well, on the right hand side here, we've got, not on the right hand side here, just below here, we have a property called name. And this accepts a pipeline input true by value or by property name. Okay, so we're actually going to concentrate on by property name for a moment. I'll come back to by value later on. So let's just go and copy that. And let's just go and pop that into a new tab, just so we can come back to it later on. But we're going to focus on by property name. So on this side of the equation, get service spooler, this is actually going to be creating us not just status name, display name, but this is actually going to be creating us a variety of different properties. Now to see the properties coming back, if you go back to my previous video, you will be able to see get member. Now if we run get member, what we're going to be seeing is we're going to be seeing all the outputs of what this is actually spitting out for us. So notice there is a series of properties that this get service spooler is spitting out. Can pause and continue, can shut down, can stop, container dependent services, display name, machine name, etc, etc. Remember, when you actually run a commandlet in PowerShell like this, if you don't actually specify your properties, it will return you the default properties that that commandlet is coded for. Those default properties may be different on other commandlets. If I go and run select star, which is select everything, you'll see all of those properties actually coming back. Notice there is actually a property here called name. So when we've actually got multiple properties coming out of get service spooler, each of these properties are coming across the pipeline. So all of these properties and all of this information is being passed across this pipeline here into start service. So the start service command is receiving all of this information. And what the start service command is going to do is the start service command is going to look through its collection of parameters. Let's just go back and have a look at that quickly. So if we do get help start service full, it will go through and look through each of these parameters on this side and go, do I have a parameter that is actually accepting pipeline input? Yes, I do actually. I have this one that's accepting pipeline input called name. Do I have a parameter accepting pipeline input by property name? Yes, I do. This is called name, and it's accepting a pipeline input by property name. What does that mean? Well, it means that if we look up here, we can actually make a match. So if the property name being passed across on side 1 is called name, and the parameter that's actually inputting into is called name, that is going to perform what's known as a pipeline hookup. In this case, the final string input of spooler is actually going to be passed from here, name is equal to spooler, and that is going to end up in the property of dash name on the other side. Now, you have to have this pipeline hookup occur between these two elements, get service spooler, pipe to start dash service. That way that when we're doing a pipeline hookup by property, it knows what information to put in there. For example, if the pipeline hookup worked differently and it took something like status running, if you click into the shell it always clicks down like that. If you take status equals running, well, if you pass that across to name spooler, that wouldn't work very well, because start service name running, that's not going to work too well for us. We're going to need to actually put in a name for that bit of information. We're going to need to tell it what to actually start here, and since that information is being passed across the pipeline as a property, you get this pipeline hookup. You're not going to get a pipeline hookup on absolutely everything you do, and sometimes you might need to actually force a pipeline hookup by passing the data in a slightly different way into the system, and this is where something called calculated properties actually comes in. So I'm just going to open up a new PowerShell shell here. Just open up a whole new PowerShell tab, and we'll go and check out something called calculated properties. So, what have we got with calculated properties? If I go and run something like get process, okay, and I run that, I get a nice list of processes come back. Notice I get a number of properties actually come back from here: handles, npm, pmws, cpu, sid, and so on and so forth. If you want to know what each of these stand for, go look at the documentation. You'll be spending your life looking at documentation within PowerShell. It's the way things actually work. But let's go and select some information off that. Let's go select name, and let's go and select ID. So we'll just run both of those. So we'll take the process ID and we'll take the actual name of the process itself. Okay, that's wonderful. So we're getting 2 columns actually return here. Well, we might want to actually go and get some more information out here. So if we go and select VM and let's just do VM for the moment actually, and hit play on that one, what have we actually got here? Well, VM, you might be thinking to yourself, is virtual machine, but actually VM in this kind of sense is virtual memory, and it's virtual memory that actually occurs for a process. The only problem is that PowerShell likes to display things a lot of the time in bytes. Now, if we're looking at virtual memory and we're looking at memory sizes for things, we don't necessarily want to see things in bytes. I mean, if we go to Task Manager and we have a look here, things are in megabytes. It's a little bit nicer and easier to read, to process, rather than have these lovely big numbers here. So what we can actually do is we can actually have something called a calculated property. Now, a calculated property allows me to do something ever so slightly different with this. So you've got to think, when we're setting up some data like this, there are 2 things to really think about. There is the title going on here of this column of data, and there is actually the data that's going to go in that column. Now we can actually go and customize that for our purposes if we really want to. So instead of using VM here, let's just get a little bit more space across here. let's just zoom out a bit. Instead of using VM, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a calculated property. I have that first one, name, I have ID, I have VM. Let's delete VM. So what I'm going to create is I'm going to create a very basic hash table. Now we'll come back to hash tables later on when we've got at and we've got these two curly brackets. These two curly brackets normally denote a script block, but if you see the at symbol in front of them, it denotes a hash table. What is a hash table? A hash table is essentially a way of displaying data. It's just a column and a collection of data and a title. That's all. Okay. So in this case, we need to essentially create pretty much a custom column. And to do that, there's those two things we need. We need the actual title of that column and the data that's going to go in that column. So let's go and change that name around from -VM. And let's go and name this something else. The name is going to be virtual memory. This is just going to make it look a little bit better in here. Take note of the single inverted quotes. They are actually quite important. And we'll split this up. So the name is equal to virtual memory. And then we'll put a semicolon in to put a divider in. And we'll put E in there. So E is actually for expression. So the expression is the data that's going to go in that column. Okay, for each individual line. So we're going to use something called $PS item. Okay, I'm going to do $PS item .vm, and we're just going to close that off there. So what is this thing here, $PS item? Because you may have seen this before in quite a few bits of PowerShell code. In fact, you may have seen $PS item, or you may have seen $_. Okay, those are the two most common ways of actually performing this. What this actually is, it's a variable. A variable contains data, and we will have a section on variables later on. But this is a default variable, one that contains information that's being passed across the pipeline. So let's go and have a look at what I mean by that. Well, if I do this get process and just go select -first one, and that's just going to select the first process, and I'll just run select star on there. So this is all of the properties of the very first process in that list. So we have a big list of processes here. All I've just done is selected the first row in the list, the background transfer host here, by taking get process and saying select first one. And then I've said select star, which is going to give me all of the properties. So we can see all of these individual properties of this process. There's quite a few bits and bobs that were not being displayed by default. There's its VM. You see 2199179878400. Not particularly great. And what we're going to do here is we're essentially going to say, look, this $_ dot or $PS item, they are exactly the same thing. It's just an abbreviation. This is a default variable that contains all of this information in it. Okay, so when get process is running, get process is passing all of those properties across the pipeline. It's passing them into the commandlet select. In fact, it's not a commandlet called select. The full commandlet is select-object. I was just abbreviating it, that's all. And it still works abbreviated. So if we do $PS item .vm, that will actually be this information here, $PS item .vm, the information that's being passed across the pipeline. If I do something like $PS item .path, that will be populated with this information. If I do $PS item .handle, it'll be populated with that information, and so on and so forth. That variable contains all the properties that are being passed across the pipeline. So in this case, I'm saying name virtual memory, as in I need a column titled virtual memory, and the expression, whoops, let's try not to break it, and the expression, the contents of that is going to be $PS item .vm, i.e. it's going to be the virtual machine memory size that's being passed across this pipeline. So I just need to put another curly bracket in there. So let's go and run this and see what happens. And so we can see now I actually have 3 columns: name, ID, and virtual memory. Rather than actually having name, ID, and VM, we're making the data look a little prettier. We're displaying it a little nicer. And then the nicer and prettier you can display your information to your users or to your colleagues, the more likely it is they're going to use this. The other thing here being is the virtual memory is still being displayed as bytes, but PowerShell does have a trick up its sleeve for that. PowerShell does actually understand memory types, as in memory calculations, sorry. If in this little script block of expression psitem.vm, I can actually say divide that by 1 MB. And it understands that is a megabyte. It understands megabytes, gigabytes, bits, bytes, and so on and so forth. So what I'm saying is take this information in bytes and divide it by 1 megabyte. And that way, if we go and run that code again, we will actually see this information being displayed as megabytes. Interestingly, this is being displayed as megabytes, but with a slightly extended floating point there. So it's actually giving me a lot more points of accuracy than I really want. We can change this around with a format operator if we really want to as well. If we go and just look this up, we can actually look at if we look for format operators in PowerShell, again coming back to this lovely SS64, we can actually use these format operators to go off and trim certain things in our environment if we really want to. So we can look through here and we can say, okay, I can use a format operator of n for number and actually give a precision of decimal places. So down here a format operator of, for example, n3 will actually give you a trimmed to 3 decimal places rather than however many decimal places it actually needs. Very, very, very useful little article down there about format operators. So we can trim that up and we can make it look even prettier if we really want to. And we'll come back to hash tables and how to display multiple bits of data later on too. And that concludes pipelines and calculated properties.